Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, it is time to take your questions, and they're all coming from Bluesky this week. And first one is from Mary E. Wright, who asks, could the Canadian public get clarity from environmentalists slash scientists on the cheapest, quickest, most sustainable way to transition away from fossil fuels? Is carbon capture and storage a viable way forward? So this is more actually a question for environmental economists because we already know the science. And science is not policy, which is an important thing you need to remember. But we already know the cheapest and most efficient way, which was a ever-rising carbon price, which would incentivize people to make better choices and incentivize industry to reduce emissions, to reduce costs, and to provide alternatives because that's what the market would demand. And instead, we decided to not properly defend the system, to say all kinds of wrong things about it, and to denigrate it and eventually just capitulate and, essentially let the system destroy itself until Mark Carney pulled the plug, which was, a mistake if you ask me, but the politics demanded eventually that something needed to happen around it. So that's what happened. Carbon capture and storage is theoretically able to work at scale, but it's extremely costly to do so. And what helps make it cost efficient? Well, a suitably high enough carbon price. Without that, it basically requires government subsidies to function, which would then let oil companies essentially subsidize the costs while they privatize the profits from their ongoing operations, which is something we don't want to happen. So, the question has largely, or the answer from environmental economists and from the National Roundtable on Energy Economy and so on has long been an ever-rising carbon price is the best and most efficient way to reduce emissions and get us off fossil fuels, and we blew it. So now we're on to the less efficient and far less cost-efficient ways, which is not going to be good for anyone, particularly now that we're in a moment where people are saying, well, treating reducing emissions as though it's a luxury as opposed to a necessity, because climate change has costs, and those costs are rising, and we need to stop pretending that they're not. The next question is from Charles Meyer, who asks, is there a possible path and political will for closing the wealth gap, helping the less fortunate with housing and food, more public transport, all the good stuff that keeps getting stalled? Well, I would like to think so, but it's incredibly hard when so much of the discourse is taken up by the cut tax and deregulate crowd. These are the voices that get amplified in legacy media because they're the ones who talk the loudest, and legacy media will listen to them. They will both sides it occasionally with a labor economist or someone like that. But those are the voices that tend to win out because that's the ethos that we're kind of stuck in ever since, I would say, probably the 1980s. Reagan, Thatcher, Mulroney, that kind of thing. So I think, if we were to find a sustainable path to do things like closing the wealth gap, it would require essentially convincing people that it's far less costly to deal with housing and transit and food insecurity and so on than it is to let status quo go on, but people don't want to hear that particular argument. So I wish I had an answer as to how we could make people hear that argument, but unfortunately, that's not within my particular powers. Next question is from Ryan Humphrey, who asks, do you think the federal government should be doing more to hold the provinces to account for not doing their jobs when it comes to things like funding healthcare and education? I feel like when the feds screw up, the provinces all line up to call them out, but you never see it go the other way. While they also line up to blame the federal government for their own failures, which is part of the problem. It's hard to say whether the federal government should be doing more, because then that sort of creates this paternalistic expectation, like the federal government is the parental level of government and the provinces are children, when they're not. They're co-equal levels of government. And I like to say, our Constitution has a division of powers, not a devolution of powers. So it's hard for the federal government to, yes, I do think the federal government needs to be more vocal when saying the provinces have not done things like properly funding their healthcare systems, even in the face of rising healthcare transfers from the federal government. Provinces have not done their jobs when it comes to building housing, that kind of thing. But then when the federal government does that, they get blowback. Like we saw this happen with housing. Trudeau said at one point, the federal government doesn't have the most carriage on this file. The provinces have the most levers. And everyone freaked out and was like, oh, how very dare you? And, federal jurisdiction is whatever people decide it is, and bizarre things like that. So it's really hard to, have the federal government say too much without it blowing back on them, and people saying, oh, you're finger pointing, oh, you're blame shifting, that kind of thing, rather than especially those of us in the media doing things like holding premiers to account for their failures, which nobody seems to want to do. And I wish I had a better way of trying to convince my compatriots that this is the things we should be doing. But nobody wants to hear that, and nobody wants to actually do that particular job. So yes, I do think the federal government does need to be more vocal. A good example is with bail reform. The problem is not the criminal code. The problem is provinces underfunding their court systems. And every now and again, they will actually say this, but not often enough, and not enough for it to be driven home. And this is the kind of thing that we do need to hear more from, but it needs to be done very carefully and very precisely. Otherwise, it just turns back into the blame shifting, finger pointing whole thing. Next up is from Mike, who asks, the BC Ferries story has been a big one lately, with a lot of disinformation and spin thrown around. Can you outline what a path to expanding our domestic ship industry might look like? Well, that was the whole point of the domestic shipbuilding system that the Conservatives put into place under Harper, which was to have the two shipyards basically constantly running warships on one side, non-combat ships on the other side. And it was supposed to, create an industry and have it sustained for, at least a generation. That was the whole point. And then a few years later, Davie Shipyard got added as the third. So yeah, that was the whole point of that system, was to, basically restart, recapitalize the shipbuilding system in this country. So I'm not sure what else government can or should do without just directly subsidizing shipyards that really should not be subsidized. And that was part of the thing with this BC Ferry story. Was one of the things that kept coming up was Canadian shipyards didn't bid on it because they don't have capacity to build those ferries for like 10 years. And that was part of the problem. And so it's a question of Sure, governments can keep throwing contracts at them, and they might make the decision to expand their capacity with new slips and dockyards and so on. But you got to be careful. You know, it's a whole thing about being careful that you're not that the work doesn't dry up after after 5 years or so on, and then they have to shutter everything. So it's all about trying to maintain that balance. That's what they've been trying to do. I don't know how successful it's been because this turned into a big whole problem. But again, it's part of the reason why it turned into a problem was because of the disinformation around it. So they also need to be better at countering that, which is something that this government is absolutely terrible about doing. And our last question comes from Jean Anderson, who asks, will Canadians ever understand the divisional of constitutional powers between levels of government when they choose who to vote for? God, I wish. I really, really wish. And I mean, there's a part of me that, needs to be optimistic that yes, one day Canadians will learn the division of powers. But unfortunately, so long as legacy media continues to obscure them and continues to flow all blame toward the federal government, it's really hard to see the path forward, particularly because the civics education in this country absolutely sucks. And we need to be better at that. And some of us try to do our part, like we write books about these things in the hopes that people will get the hint and take the lesson. And a few people do, but unfortunately, we have a problem with legacy media in this country around this particular issue. As I was just explaining a couple of questions ago. And so, yeah, I mean, I desperately hope that Canadians can learn this, but unfortunately, it feels like the deck is stacked against us at this point. And that's everything for this week. Thank you for all of your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at Journo_Dale on Twitter and JournoDale, no underscore on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.